Hi, Dave. It's Mark Woodard, and I'm doing a PowerPoint presentation for my topic, which was historical impacts of consumer electronics on American industry and society. And I basically decided to do this topic as a way of showing how consumer electronics have increased productivity over American history and how they've also impacted labor and also how they've created some problems within society, but have also solved others. So here we go. So to start off, before there were any electronics, information technology pre 1850 consisted of information being sent by mail, and that information could only reach its destination as fast as ships could sail across the Atlantic, or as fast as trains could ride across land, or horses. And these high travel times or high lead times led to inaccuracies of current demand requirements. And this problem with information not getting quick enough to between business parties, it contributed to a lot of recessions because demands were either overshot and investors either put in too much money, or they didn't account for the influxes that were to happen because of these inaccuracies. So this is kind of the way the norm. This is how the norm was, even as transportation improved to steamboats. The lead times were decreased, but still there was no way of actually avoiding recessions from happening. This all changed in the 1840s when Samuel Morse invented the telegraph, which basically revolutionized long distance communication. It was used for several reasons. One being, like I said before, communicating financial information between business parties. It was also used in the transportation sectors of our economy, for railroads, being used for delays and for arrival times for trains. And it was also used to it was also for public use at local telegraph stations where people could go to and spend an exuberant amount of money to send a short message for whatever important reason there was. But no sole individual owned a telegraph at their home because it was too expensive, and the infrastructure lines at the time were not developed well enough. They were sort of in their infant stages for people to be able to own telegraphs at their own home. That all changed going into the late 1800s and early 1900s when their Western expansion, due to the gold rush, created a demand for faster communications between undeveloped communities and bigger cities. And so Alexander Graham Bell ended up solving this problem by inventing the telephone, which could send voice transmissions. And the thing about voice transmissions is that the cost of the transmission itself became less expensive than the telegraph. So it basically inspired the government and encouraged the government to build more landline infrastructures around communities, and people, telephones became like the first, I guess you could say, commercially, or one of the first commercially owned electronic devices for communication, owned at the household. So this was a huge advantage for communities and for people. It provided emergency communication between community members and local municipalities in the case of like fires or burglaries. It also helped improve private business at the home, increasing revenue levels for small businesses, for all Americans, and it was a really great thing. And the actual landline itself spanned across many parts of the country, and there was such a high demand for faster connection, for available service, and this created a new job sector in the telecommunications industry, which were switchboard operators. And that's what this picture is right here. There are many women switchboard operators that are basically connecting one party to another over the telephone line. And this job, of course, became obsolete after the invention of automated switchboard technology. But it still shows how telecommunications had changed the labor market back then. So going on, shortly after, in the early 1900s, radio technology came around, and it was actually really important because, as opposed to information being sent across hard wired lines, this technology could send communication and voice transmissions over radio waves, which requires absolutely no infrastructure besides owning a radio and an antenna and a tuner. And this technology was first implemented, or one of the earliest implementers was John Wanamaker in his department stores, where he would play music for his customers as they went shopping. And the radio was really important, especially in the early 1900s. It marked the beginning of social technological consumerism in America, and it was really important as an item at the house for entertainment. And everyone owned a radio back then, and it brought families together for entertainment. There was a wide variety of different programs. And it was also a really inexpensive form of entertainment, and that was really important during the Great Depression, when nobody had any money. You know, everybody was poor, and this kind of satisfied that need during such harsh times. It also created new jobs in the communications industries, including DJs and radio hosts, and a lot of people who wanted to create stations to basically have their own content and variety. So, because of radio's popularity, it really grew. It became so big that the United States government had to regulate the content and its use over the radio waves, because there were companies. As more companies kept joining or kept creating stations over the radio waves, the amount of bandwidth kept being used up, and there's a limited amount of bandwidth that exists over radio waves. So, the rise in stations led to a rise in broadcasting costs due to the limited bandwidth, and the big companies that had come about that had the money to pay for the high costs were CBS and NBC. They'd kind of put up their own type of barrier on the industry itself, where independent radio had a tough time trying to come over. And people will say, you know, older people will say that, you know, radio before CBS and NBC used to be a lot more. There used to be a lot more variety, and there was more of an educational tone to radio. It wasn't such so flashy, and there wasn't so much, you know, content being spilled out over a quicker period of time. And so, you know, the conflicts, because of CBS's and NBC's rise over radio, there were many conflicts over the content between the public and those entities. So the government created the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, and the Federal Radio Commission to allocate and distribute stations accordingly, so that way any one party couldn't have complete control over the radio waves. And it was also especially important during World War II, when radio wave space had to be allocated for military communications across the Atlantic Ocean. So, World War II. Hello. I don't know what that was. Why is my Sorry about that. So World War II, when that came around, television was sort of in its early period, and it was used in such a way during the war where America could film its battles and its progress throughout Europe. And so America could use that as a way of spreading its economic influence to other countries, and that was sort of important for America to be able to hold its stronghold in world economy post World War II. And so after World War II, when television actually became a consumer item, and it was taken out, or it was given to consumers on the market, it immediately just became a hot item and pretty much replaced radio as the primary means of entertainment at the home. It brought families together. That's why I put this picture right here, because it pretty much exemplifies exactly how television was, and how its effect was on the family. And a lot of changes happened from television. For one, well, during the 1950s, like a little bit later, especially when color TVs came about after there was a color standard that CBS had perfected, and that became kind of the broadcasting standard for TV. That boosted profits for many appliance stores who were selling TVs, including Sears, Roebuck and Company. And also, just the visual advertising that came from TV as opposed to radio increased consumer response to advertising. And that's why I put this picture right here with a Band-Aid commercial. And it's just, people bought into advertising a lot more when they could see satisfaction from other consumers or actors on the TV saying, displaying how much they like a product. So that was a huge deal, a huge game changer in advertising. And it also created a lot more technical jobs in the telecommunications industry. Lots of engineers setting up new infrastructures over what were called high or ultra high frequency waves, which actually stands above, or it's greater than radio waves. So it was basically the way how television and radio could exist at the same time, just over different spectrums of wave frequencies in the air. In the history of TV, or throughout the history of TV, there has been questionable content. CBS being a perpetrator of questionable content in the past, specifically suggestive racist content, and censorship became a really huge deal during the advent of television. And this especially became important, or this specific issue became important during the 1960s, during the Civil Rights Revolution, which probably wouldn't have gained its following, or there wouldn't have been such an awareness for civil rights movement if it hadn't been for TV. Over 90% of households in America owned a TV, and it created more of a realistic picture for families or individuals with good morals, people who believed in this, and became a popular idea that civil rights was a good thing, and it definitely aided into helping the civil rights movement. So basically, TVs, which were made out of vacuum tubes, they were very large. Eventually, the size of the TV shrank after the invention of the integrated circuit and the transistor. And one of the big inventions that came out of the integrated circuit and transistor was the computer, which had been in development in early World War II as a way of storing information, being able to make calculations for various uses. But one of the big things about the computer was being able to send large amounts of storage information between two locations, and that came after the internet. But around the 1970s, computers were used. They were programmed to be able to do lots of things for several different applications, and they became very popular as a way of in business as a way of centralizing document and information storage. So before computers, there were paper file storing systems, filing cabinets, which took up large amounts of space and occupied lots amount of room in office buildings. And this was very inefficient because there was always the chance of documents being lost or stolen, or the effect of long-term effects of document integrity. And so having an electronic copy of any document was very was good because it minimized the loss of document integrity, and it eliminated these large room capacities. Um, so you had one machine which was basically programmed to do several different applications, business applications, and it could over time after the invention of the internet could send that information to different business parties, as opposed to having to mail the information, um, or when the fax machine came around, that's kind of like the same thing. But being able to send that electronically was a really huge deal during the advent of the computer. Computers also were embedded into other machines later on. They became embedded into cars, into medical equipment, and they also became used as They became used in machines on factory floors. Like as you can see here, I have this picture of a bunch of machines making cars that are automated by computers. And so, as you may guess, computers are one of the huge reasons, or is the big reason behind automation and a change in labor. Companies realized that if you had a machine, you could make a product much faster, 24/7, in almost any manufacturing environment. And for companies needing to stay in competition, this became kind of a necessity. So a lot of there was a lot of changes in jobs, and jobs became more switched to operations of computers that would operate these machines on the factory floor, rather than actually building the manufacturing or building the item itself through mechanical or through hand or by hand. So along with like personal computers, since operating machines by the use of computers became so important, there became this huge market for creating the most user-friendly operating system, and companies such as Microsoft or Macintosh became really big in trying to create the most user-friendly interface for computers to interact with these machines. And so as companies began to send larger amounts of information to each other through computers, and as the demand for faster speed for processors increased, that eventually led to labor outsourcing, and companies could use the computer to send data to services overseas rather than using services in their own country with their own workers. And that is one of the huge controversial topics in modern American history. Is when does this stop? When do companies to what extent are companies going to use automation technology in replacing human jobs? And it's one of the scarier things to have to think about. So, as a conclusion, advancements in electronics, they've created many opportunities They've given higher productivity to business through the use of automation and computers. They've connected customers with business in advertising, and they've also given business competitive advantage in information transmission and also in information storage and information integrity. But in retrospect, they've also created a lot of social problems, loss of employment. They've created a cultural awareness which has increased a lot of stress for people, and it's also created a certain amount of dependency on electronics for searching for answers, and it's created an environment where people have stopped thinking for themselves, and it's created a certain degree of laziness where people can just search for an answer on Google. And it's also because of the unregulated nature of the internet and the connection of computer networks. Electronics have created this whole exposure to non-credible news sources in modern times, and it's a problem that still hasn't been addressed yet, but we shall see what happens in the future. So that's my presentation, and I hope you enjoyed it, and I'm looking forward to seeing you on Thursday. All right.